Well, fiscama a cháirtean agus fáilte go Súl Ostaig sa mé tailite uair a gcéine éicinn crín cóla seo nach taingeh garig éise hartin astar sin a bhí cólarin a fiúine seo bó éirin agus bó inar-nàiseanta dh'fhaodadh sin tailite féicinn seo nach. Nis bhhealm fáilte háirite a chur prúsapol agus eadar-nàiseanta Eilean Gàidhealtachd na Eilean an talamh Clive Mulholland go Súl Ostaig an t-Àrd-Ollamh son canan is culture na Gàidhlig agus an-diugh an na cópháirteachas an Òraid. Buní an talamh Mulholland de cheanna tua na héireann agus her a bhí an Jeffrey-Griachan an Eilean Uli is Queens an Beal Ferste an t-Àrd-Ollamh. Agus cúteach an Swansea nó Abertawe is Òraid Ceannaigh na Cymru an t-Saoghail. Mastánige go Eilean Gàidhealtachd is na Eilean an san ágfias da bhílas a céir bha na lis henselar an Òraid Ceannaigh na Cymru. Agus mar a haar Suidheachadh ganis an trí dúchanan cilteach, bí an talamh Mulholland máchail de chúisin Mion-chànanan, sami cínteach go bhí uaice an snuvis ag náirtíe de rá an iasca seo mo chor Mion-chànanan. I should like to welcome Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of the Highlands and Islands, Professor Clive Mulholland, to Súl Ostaig, the National Centre for Gaelic Language and Culture, and one of the jewels, we would claim, in the crown of the UHI partnership. Professor Mulholland hails from Northern Ireland and has held various posts in the universities of Ulster and Queen's Belfast in his homeland, and in Swansea and the University of South Wales in another Celtic land. Before moving to UHI in June 2014, he was Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Wales. And as one who has been employed now in 3 Celtic countries, Professor Mulholland will be aware of minority language matters, and I'm sure he'll be interested in what our lecturer this evening has to say about the minority language condition. Professor Mulholland.
Fiskarma Agash Falcha. Good evening and welcome. I'm delighted to welcome so many of you here to Súl Ostaig this evening for this University of the Highlands and Islands inaugural lecture by Professor Conchúr Ó Giollagáin. Inaugural professorial lectures are an incredibly important part of an academic's life. They give the academic the opportunity to profess, to show us the knowledge, the research that they have focused an incredible amount of energy and effort on, thus demonstrating how important they are to them. It's not very often that we do inaugural lectures in the university. We do maybe 3 or 4 a year. So they're very special events. And I'm hoping tonight you will get a feel for just how important the work that an individual like Professor Ó Giollagáin is carrying out. As director of the SOLSIA project, Professor Ó Giollagáin coordinates and extends research into crucial areas for the growth of Gaelic and its various social and institutional settings. He leads a team of research fellows, lecturers, and PhD students who are based at partner institutions across Scotland, including Súl Ostaig, Lewes Castle College, and the universities of Aberdeen, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. Professor Ó Giollagáin previously lectured in the School of Political Sciences and Sociology in the National University of Ireland, Galway, on the sociology of language. His teaching and research interests include language planning, sociolinguistics, and linguistic anthropology. He was also head of the university's language planning unit, where he devised and led Ireland's first MA programme in language planning and contributed to the development of its MA in language sciences. Professor Ó Giollagáin received his PhD in Modern Irish from University College Dublin and lectured in the Department of Irish at St Patrick's College, Dublin City University, and in the Department of Celtic Studies at the Catholic University of Lublin in Poland. He co-authored the government-commissioned Gàidhealtachd survey entitled Comprehensive Linguistic Study of the Use of Irish in the Gàidhealtachd. Professor Ó Giollagáin is also an external fellow of the National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. Here, he has contributed to a variety of research projects examining different aspects of the language dynamics and linguistic anthropology of minority language culture. Tonight's inaugural lecture will offer a reappraisal of the minority language condition from the joint perspective of local and global challenges. Professor Ó Giollagáin will examine how modernity has influenced our contemporary world in contradictory ways. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Conchúr Ó Giollagáin for his inaugural lecture this evening. Thank you.
A Òraid in cóide, ha mi talite go bhfuil an corfam seo agam, an Òraid seo thuirseachad an Diugh, chomhla rúth an san tómhór, agus ha mi teangail go bhfuil cóbrasin bho fárstin eile go Gàidhealtachd na Gàidhealtachd na Eilean, crín cóla ring san éisteach. Ba tuile mar rá go mi fada an cumann Professor Clive Mulholland, Chancellor an Oilthigh, agus professoran Ian Bryden agus Neil Simcoe agus iad Ruchgach an Oilthigh ar fad. Ha mi géirí tang a hors cuideach the Professor Boyd Robiston agus luch obrach an tómhór go léir. A ha bhí cho taichil agus cuidechil cho bhó hánig mi a seo. Agus ma hang cuideach the skippe heilse an san tómhór a ha an drasta ag obair go trang san na Eilean project Rannsachaidh na Gàidhlig sin Gordon Wells, Padraig Murach agus Gordon Cameron. Ba tulam cuideach ma hang a thuirseachad chum a cho stúrichin sailse. Gillian Roch a ha cólaring an Diugh, Robert a Mualala an Oilthigh Glasachú, agus Wilson MacCloyd an an Dúnéidean, agus Michelle Nicloyd an an Oberjain. A réir mar a hasisi be Clinton an sin, is sé praise co-obrachaí a ha an sailse. Mar sin ha mi fadan cumann na nolaighean eile a an sas an an project an Rannsachaidh heilse a ha an chuireann gríomh ag a skippe chultarail agus íorchultarail. A bharach ar sin is sé tlach mór a ha an chónsa go bhfuil tóirghoine von scírin anadal ad seo an Diugh san T-Saoghail sa Despatse. Ha cudramach nach bí daine an sna cóirsnachan a farachan go bí loch na nolaighean an brín etar a héin a bhain, ach go bí a Suidheachadh go bí sin I déanamh urp lentanach conaltrach a dhéanamh ris na daine an sna cóirsnachan. Ha mi dúil ris an Òraid seo a thuirseachad an an Gàidhlig agus an béarla. Ha dirimh ró a bhí a brín ar cosparan sòisio-chultarail an Gàidhlig, mar sin díring ormh a bhí faidianach nar a ha mi ag fachlan úra a chaiach ruachach agus na haraghaint agam a dhéanamh. Brín mi an san Gàidhlig nar a ha mi ag gamas ar puingan a has dóchad nas nádora, agus an san bhéirle nar a haimi amach gróichin nas techniche. Is cínteach nach bí sibh féin a géirí a bhí a géisteach rí fachlan mar sin an Gàidhlig. A ríist bhín nar cumann na bích sibh faidineach agus mí a léim bhó chanan go canan. Coiú, ní mí ma dícheal agus haimi an dóchas gon sic sin uile amacha ag a cheann háil go sláán sábhailte. An drú haimi géirí a bhí a smúnachuch an slí ar áirst. An dói nach bhfuil echtrí mar úlach ach mar bhearstir sagin. Agus sáiliú na fealsanach cultural a ha an drasta agin ma dhéon cúsin umadach ha spéis nas alain ga dúlchas cultural na Mion-chànanan agus an únam ha chorm agin a bhí a t-Saoghail na tradition academica a hagin go háirid ans na gréachan Celteach. Ach ag an únam féimi sin feinach an de cleach sin an seala cearst an a bhí a céad ar Thighinn. Ha aisling bhria agin de chultúran agus go chultúran sáinrite a bhí cála rí chéile ach ag an únam ha sin mesal an numadach ach a bhfuil sin i seachnach an tíochaí far a bhfuil sin. Sálamh go bhfuil é dirbh fúslach ein na ceistin sin. Mar ha an ínis i seoltan go bhfuil an bhionchuid slugach leis an mórchuid, agus sin an dúlan a ha an drasta acin. Mar sin, I wish to base my discussion today on 6 defining characteristics of the minority language condition. The first one is the generalized demographic fragility in the minority-speaking groups. And the common feature there in relation to demography is that most native-speaking groups are contracting at a faster rate than we're producing productive speakers. When we move on to the second issue of the geographic dimension, minority language groups are generally losing their social dominance in their traditional locus. Obviously, this is related to the demographic issue. There is a linguistic issue also, that the minority, especially young speakers, minority speakers socialized in bilingualism, they tend to have a stronger proficiency in the majority language rather than in the minority language, even in the circumstances when they are raised in the minority language, the imbalance. The issue of socialization, that even when we have institutional provision for minority groups, the young speakers in the minority community generally tend to follow the social dominance of the majority group. In other words, we provide institutional provision for the minority, but they are socialized in the majority in that group, that our institutions are not able to counteract the sociology of minoritization. The political issue is an issue of, because of the imbalanced power dynamics, we are not able to focus what we are doing on the actual community, and we tend to abstract it out as commodity, that we turn the minority language into a commodity and people consume it rather than live in the language. And the final issue I wish to address also is the type of public and institutional debate that we have around these issues, that we tend to emphasize the symbolism of diversity rather than the social reality of erosion. In other words, it's easier to talk about diversity rather than live in diversity. Now, to give a little demographic context to these points I've raised earlier, if we look at the distribution of the demography of languages throughout the world on this this chart is taken from data that Ethnologue has produced. If we look at the languages with a speaker base of over 10 million, and some of these languages are mega languages, there are 8 languages in the world with 100,000 speakers. That's 1% of the world's languages are spoken by 80% of the population of the world. So 80% of the world's population only has 1% of our diversity. If we look then at the group we are in, it's the mid-range group of language. These are languages with a speaker base of over 1,000 and other languages with a speaker base of over 10,000. These represent over 50% of the linguistic groups in the world, but they only represent 1% of the world's population. To put it another way, where the linguistic action is, that is not where the demographic action is. So on the left-hand side there of the chart, we have the mega languages and the big languages with speaker bases over 10,000 or 100,000. That is 80% of the world's population. And we see in the blue line then, the red line indicates populations, and the blue line indicates languages. And the group that the Gaelic languages of Ireland and Scotland are in, you see that is where the peak of cultural and linguistic diversity is. This is explaining the divergence between demographic change in the world and linguistic change in the world, that we do not have the demographic processes driving the linguistic issues in the world at the minute. If we are to take and I don't want to talk too much about statistics today, if we're to take one example of the linguistic data from Ireland, and I'll take another one from Scotland now in a minute, we see here, this is the distribution of the language questions in the Irish census for the 3,410 electoral divisions. These are statistical units we use for analysis of census data. The top line is the ability line, indicating that over 40% in Ireland claim they have an ability in Irish. The middle line are the daily speakers of Irish, corresponding to around 40%, and the bottom line, 2% of the Irish population. These are the daily speakers of Irish outside of the educational system. In other words, they are not dependent on the educational system for their use of Irish. And you can see the areas above the curve, in all those 3 curves, they correspond to the 155 electoral divisions within the Gàidhealtachd. So once we leave the Gàidhealtachd, we are into a flatlining scenario of demography rather than showing diversity. The Scottish example, what we've done here is we've taken 25 research areas in the Western Isles, part of Skye and Tiree, and we've looked at all the households where the adults and the children report the speaking of Gaelic, and we've compared that with the rest of the data. I don't know if you can see it here in the far, probably can't. The rest of the data for households corresponding with that, households where the adults and the children speak it, is 0.3 of all the households in Scotland. And we compared that to the distribution in the research areas in the Western Isles, and I would ask the question, the attention we are placing on growing the numbers of speakers outside of the Western Isles, to grow these numbers of household and communal speakers, which off a base of 0.3%, to what extent is the attention expended on these issues is taking away from the actual issues threatening the communities in which it has a communal base? That on one level we have the aspiration of growing Gaelic as a national asset, a laudable aim, the same type of aim we have in Ireland also, but is this taking focus away from the actual social or communal crisis where it is spoken not as aspiration but as social practice? If we are to look at these issues from a global context now, that these examples from here in Scotland and from Ireland are essentially just local manifestations of a global trend of endangerment. And I'll just turn to this is the tree of linguistic diversity, that during anthropological evolution, different groups dispersed throughout the globe, and from the second phase then we had cultural diversification, the emergence of different languages, different cultural groups. The problematic period for diversity in the world has been the era of modernity, especially from the Second World War onwards. And even after that, post-modernity, the type of hyper-modernity we have at the minute. That cultural phase for diversity, especially for the minority languages, has been equivalent to a cultural chainsaw effect. That it has pruned away this diversity. It has been very, very difficult for the cultural minorities to negotiate modernity in a way that makes the group sustainable. And we are moving into a new Anthropocene, that is a new period of cultural change that is geared towards mega languages and very strong languages. That modernity has pruned out the smaller minority languages, and we're moving into a phase which is less diverse, which is in contradiction with the style of philosophy we have about diversity. That we practice a philosophy that isn't in keeping with the demographic challenges we face at the minute. To put it in an easy way, we are moving from an Anthropocene of diversity, where the world is made up of 7,000 language groups. We're probably moving into a phase now where any languages beyond the strongest 300 or 400 are in a dynamic of endangerment. You could call it the Cosmopolitan Anthropocene. And there are two dimensions to this. There's a geographic dimension. It's the erosion of the regional diversity, the sub-regions of the world that do not have economic or political power. And there's an historical dimension to it also, that the groups that held the former diversity, they are dispossessed of their cultural heritage. In other words, they are cut off from their history. It is the equivalent of a socio-cultural amputation. Myself and colleagues, two of them are here today, are publishing an article on this later on in the year, and this is the only quote that I'm going to read out today. An overly retrospective view of heritage and aesthetics, in conjunction with the common failure of sociology to recognize the threat of linguistic extirpation, in other words, elimination, conspire to avoid implications of postmodernity for cultural and autochthonous diversity, autochthonous native diversity. In the context of postmodernity's linguistic destructiveness, i.e., the pervasive cultural scenario of imminent language death, both language studies and sociology are insufficient to the task. And as I was saying there, both Brian O'Curnan and William Stewart are here if anybody wants to take issues with those points, rather than just addressing me. Okay. I think if we were to locate these issues, especially this issue of endangerment, within the discipline of Celtic studies, because to a large extent the discipline of Celtic studies has been the type of intellectual leadership we've given our groups that hold this linguistic diversity in the islands of Britain and Ireland. And when we think about it, the Celtic studies as a discipline was formed institutionally in the 19th century during the high water mark of British cultural and institutional formation. So I suppose what I'm saying there is one of the most native aspects of the culture of these islands is actually one of the most British aspects. It's an irony. But the difficulty for us now is that we have a discipline carrying a lot of academic status, and essentially the subsections of that discipline, philology, linguistic description, textual analysis, literary and cultural heritage, and minority creative expression, they are the status-bearing elements of the intellectual tradition we have, but to a large extent that they are the 19th century aesthetic sensibilities trying to deal with sociological and cultural issues of the 21st century, which is an issue of risk. That on the one level, we have former intellectual sensibilities not addressing the nature of cultural risk that we live with nowadays. And I would pose the question, is contemporary scholarship, led from many of the universities in these islands, at odds with collective concerns we live with nowadays? One of the concessions that the formalized academic tradition of Celtic studies has made to the contemporary era has been the inclusion of a post-structural sociolinguistics from the 80s onwards. In other words, the vast majority of Celtic scholars deal with issues of philology and cultural analysis and literary analysis, but in many of these Celtic studies departments, they allowed for scholars to take on issues of the sociology of Gaelic, Irish, Welsh, and so on. So in a way, we have high-status Celtic studies married or wedded to post-structural sociology. Post-structural sociology is the sociology of postmodernism, essentially. But the post-structural approach to these issues is basically consumerist. It doesn't look at the issues that are pertinent to the group. It looks at the issues of people consuming this culture as a secondary or as an occasional culture or as an individual culture. It does not prioritize the anthropological or ethnological issues that are related to this. In a way, we are allowed, when we look at it from that point of view, we could ask another question. To what extent is the discipline of Celtic studies married to this type of post-structural sociolinguistics? To what extent is it a closed or a circular discourse? That most people who live with the challenges of endangerment, to what extent do they feel does the formalized Celtic studies setup address the issues that they live with from day to day? When we look at the anthropological issues, what has happened to the anthropological resources of Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh, the vast majority of minority cultures in the world? And when we think about it, Irish especially is the spoilt child of minority languages in the world. It has the most minority language institutional provision of any culture in the world. And still we deal with this issue of endangerment. We are probably now into the last generation of communal speakers of Irish unless we are able to come up with a new mechanism of supporting these communities. I have termed this before the tragedy of the linguistic commons. And this emerges from the conflict between promoting minority cultures as an individualized culture rather than addressing the issues of the minoritized collective. To go back to the issue of the way the Celtic studies post-structural sociolinguistics addresses these issues, we can see that it conforms with the social and institutional process of status formation. This is in keeping with Pierre Bourdieu's idea that the stronger social groups look towards their social distinction rather than negotiation with the social reality of the collective. The difficulty with the social distinction of Celtic studies is that it has very weak impact on the civic culture. This is to use the Gramscian argument, that unless you have an intellectual leadership dealing with collective realities, that distinction doesn't really give leadership to a collective in its crisis. When you combine that with the short-termism of the individualized view of a collective in crisis, we can explain what is happening especially in the Celtic languages, that we tend to prioritize institutional control rather than promote institutions that engage in societal engagement. So we see the tragedy of the commons, even where we make provision for the minority group, the institutions do not address the social crisis of the group also. Son céad na puingan seo a thuh Mion-chànanan sé. So ha mi brín an seo tragedy an chuiteanais chananachas. Sé sin ha sin a céad an strí a ha ag únneach a ha an brín bhean bhuinan. Agus ha da hólan an seo. Ha dúlan heilead ann nar a ha duine a géirí cumas sa bhean-chanan a dheangnachadh ag an únam is a ha cumas sa bhór-chanan na seár ag an duine. Sé sin is comharpais chananach a haun. Comharpais idir canan a ha láidir agus canan a ha lag agus bí sin a cruachach dulidas go háirid gan ógraí a ha géirí Mion-chànanan Mion-chànanan. An láimh eile in sin, féimi sin céad t-Saoghail, nó language cognition. Mar ha fis-againn, agus sin héin a céad na cúisin seo, gan bí cumas pársanta féimach pibrachach an choirsnach. Mar an bí choirsnach ag an ógraí a ha géirí Mion-chànanan na Mion-chànanan ha go maith diribh a bhí cumasach an sa chanan sin, cumasach a bhí a brín na chanan sin. So ha an ógraí an drasta, haid a géirí cumas canan a chur an gríomh, an siachach slua a ha lag, agus an áirineach canan a ha nas lugad. So, císing an sin, ha dulidas demographic again, ach an sin, ha an strí pársanta ag an ógraí nar a haid a géirí Mion-chànanan na Mion-chànanan nar nach bhfuil de féin taich go leor von choirsnach far a bhiliad. So, to return to the issue of much of the public and institutional debate, that we can see much of the illusions of postmodernity in the minority language ideology that we practice at the minute. But we need to ask a question: does this style of debate, does it empower people in the actual struggles that we live with? I would pose another question at this stage. How can minorities survive without a socio-economic market to support a functioning linguistic group? There's a basic economic argument there. How can minorities survive unless they have a right of assembly And this right of assembly is the only way that a minority can use to give consent to support mechanisms that are used on their behalf. The issue also is, well, if young speakers need communities, well, communities essentially are social densities. If we do not promote social densities, how can we have competent speakers? Because learning a language is much more, as I said earlier, is much more than an individual activity. It needs the support of a collective. And also, we would ask the question, how can minorities survive unless we have bespoke institutional support structures to support the minorities in the social scenario they're in, rather than in the aspirational scenario we are dealing with in a lot of the ideology that we use, which is post-structural or utopian. To return to the issue of the market, essentially the process of language shift happens for two reasons: that a community cannot maintain its social density, and the socioeconomic market that's supported the community to date has become devalued. It is a devalued linguistic market. If you devalue a linguistic market, it follows from that that linguistic function in that group also, in that market, will become weakened. To a large extent, these are the difficulties we're dealing with, that we ask the question, how do we define the problem? If we are going to talk in terms of aspiration, we are not arming ourselves properly with diagnostics to be able to understand our condition. And without a proper diagnosis of our condition, it is very, very difficult for our institutions to engage with the condition. I would pose that many of the language institutions that we have in Ireland are actually participating in the trend rather than offering support to the endangered collective. To a large extent, the refusal to engage in diagnosis has resulted in a depoliticization of the minority. It gives the appearance that the minority are participating in their own demise. Well, in reality, it is a question of the minority not being offered a choice. As the Polish philosopher and sociologist said, it is the no-choice scenario. They participate in it because the power dynamics they live in dictate that. Again, are these issues pertinent just to these isles, or are we identifying issues that are universal to the minority language condition? And I'm not going to go into these, but I think we can find plenty of evidence academically and discursively throughout the world showing the same tension. If we look at the work of Silvina Montrul, who's looked at Spanish as a minority language in the United States, where they have a speaker base of millions, they are dealing with the same issues of imbalance. That even when there is a high density of Spanish speakers in a community, because the approach isn't targeted towards the social reality of the group, the vast majority of Spanish speakers, young Spanish speakers, speak English at a higher level than their Spanish. This is the same issue we are dealing with here in Scotland, in Ireland, and in Wales. And this is how I would depict this. This is taken from the book that Thomas Bitaveri published in conjunction with Brian O'Kernan and myself and Jerome Sheehan, published in 2014, and it indicates the unbalanced bilingualism of the minority language condition. And this is analysis of native speakers of Irish in the strongest Irish-speaking areas of the Galway Gàidhealtachd. And we are indicating in this diagram that it is basically a struggle between a dominated language and a dominant language. And generally, linguistic function in a language follows dominance. Put it simply, because English is the dominant language, that is the language of functional primacy. To put it simply, when the young people wish to express themselves, they have more functional ability in English, even though they're native speakers of Irish, than they have in their first language, because Irish hasn't gone through this functional process. Irish generally tends to be a bilingualized language. It is acquired at the same time of English, but English is the functional language, and that's what makes it a vigorous language, socially and cognitively. This functional conflict between a dominant, highly functional language and a dominated, weak function language, it's something similar to what Leonard Bernstein set out about the difference between working class speech and middle class speech. Why do certain classes speak at different linguistic levels? Because of the style of cultural and linguistic input they get. And he talked about the privileged classes talking in an elaborate code, and the non-privileged class with less cultural input, they talk in a restricted code. Because of the dominated scenario now of the minority languages throughout the world, probably we are looking at the scenario where most minority cultures only live in a restricted code. The difficulty there is where we have bright, ambitious children who want to go on to university, they have a cultural struggle then. The language of elaboration, the language of cognitive progression is the other culture, not their native culture. That their native culture is restricted only to certain social interactions, and because it hasn't been functionalized, it is not the language of intellectual and cultural elaboration. There is a massive challenge there for any style of institutional provision we have for our minority cultures if we are not able to develop the minority cultures as an elaborated code. In other words, that you can talk about any idea or concepts you want to in that culture. Where you have to switch to the other culture, well then you are assisting in the process of language shift. Another example of participating in the trend rather than taking on the challenge of trying to be in competition with a dominant language. To return to the issue, I mentioned the issue of intellectual leadership first. I want to look at the issue of communal leadership, and this is taken from a book that will be coming out next week, and I hope you don't think this is scurrilous advertising. We're publishing a book in Irish, Bart the t-Àrd-Ollamh, a new deal for the Irish, for the Gael, and it'll come out in English later on in the year. But I tried to indicate the crisis in cultural leadership among the Gael in Ireland, and I'm sure it reverberates with many linguistic cultures throughout the world. What I've done here is I've indicated on the left-hand side that is institutional leadership, and on the right-hand side we have communal leadership. And we can see here, to return to the issue of the socio-economic market, many of the institutions, they spring from the support they get from the functional socio-economic market of English. That is why many of the leaders come from the out cultural group rather than from the minority cultural group, because they have the cultural capital and the cultural resources of the strong culture, and that gives them the ability to avail of the elaborated code, going back to this issue of cognitive development, using the benefits of education to get ahead in life. Because we have a weak socio-economic market in the minority groups, it's very difficult to see where we have a communal leadership in minority groups independent of an institutional leadership. I think this explains to a large extent the lack of leadership in relation to the crisis in autochthony, the native group. That we are able, because of the support from the dominant culture, the socio-economic market of English in our own context. That gives an institutional leadership that is well rooted in the functional market of English, but it does not give a communal leadership for the minority within crisis. The point I'm making here is, if we are going to approach minority cultures from this point of view of institution, we can promote minority language as pastime. That people take on the minority language as an institutional or as a cultural hobby, as a pastime. From the pastime, we get an aspirational group, those who think it's a good idea that we support diversity in the world, and they take on Irish, Welsh or Gaelic as an aspirational culture that you practice as an additional culture, a secondary culture to a highly functional culture. And to a large extent, if we look at the universities in Ireland, the vast majority of people who populate the Celtic Studies departments come from this aspirational group. That they stem from the privileged classes of the functional market, and then they populate the institutional leadership. And for them, the visceral issues of an autochthonous community in crisis is a non-issue because they did not come from that group in the first place. They do not have feeling for the issue, and because they have no feeling for the issue, they do not offer leadership to the group. Looking at the issue of the crisis in leadership and then the over-institutionalized approach to these issues rather than a collectivized approach to the issues, it is no wonder that for the vast majority of minority cultures, we are dealing with the anatomy of inertia. There is this feeling that a group is descending into a socio-cultural stagnation. If you have an ambiguous leadership combined with a structural deficit, where you cannot identify bespoke structures to support the group, it is no wonder that these groups descend into a form of social stagnation. They are told just to endure their demographic hemorrhage. They're told that they have to endure the institutional misalignment. Institutions are set up for them, but they generally tend to be irrelevant to the nature of the social crisis that people live with. They're told that they have to endure this individual approach rather than a collective approach. If we're only going to have an individual approach, it's very easy to evade diagnostics. Because if everybody has their own relationship with these cultures, there's no need to form or to expend energy on developing a collective diagnostic of our condition. To an extent, this explains the type of self-censoring that we engage in. We have a highly circumscribed debate among our minority cultures, and that operates as a form of social psychology to avoid unpleasantness. We avoid the issue because there are difficult questions to answer and even more difficult solutions to devise. Minorities in this type of scenario are left to their own individual struggles, and it's something akin to amplified postmodernity. That the people are left to an anatomized version of the struggle, and the approach is generally amorphous. It's not targeted enough for the type of crisis we live with. That is why, if you were to listen to these issues in Ireland, you will hear this trope of hope all the time. People wish to talk about the future essentially because we are not addressing the present. It is easier to talk about aspiration and utopia if you're not going to spend any intellectual energy thinking about the actual reality you live with. So, what am I suggesting? Well, it's quite obvious from the nature of the critique that I'm suggesting we go down a different road completely. That we re-examine the type of post-structural sociolinguistics, this approach to the minority language which is occasional, optional, and consumerist. We need to start addressing the issues of risk. It is possible to hope for the best and at the same time to plan for risk at the same time. A starting point, I think, at this stage, for all the minority languages in these isles of Britain and Ireland, is to start talking again about the issue of assembly. How do we draw people together, especially those who hold these cultures as a primary identity? If we're not going to do that, it's very, very difficult to support adherence and then to empower a leadership. That we need some type of executive power and support structure to bolster adherence. If we talk about the issues of assembly, it is much easier to position the minority group in their own solution rather than bore them with utopian issues or an optional secondary culture. Addressing the issue of the socio-economic basis. Because the demography of these groups, especially in Scotland and in Ireland, is so weak now, we have to look beyond just a geographic approach. But we need to start talking about setting up some type of supportive socio-economic market. I return to that issue. Unless we have a market, we cannot have a minority group. And probably the way to do that, given the demographic fragility we're dealing with, we need to set up a network of communal trusts. And similar to the land trusts that we have here, that these communal trusts would be empowered by the Assembly to administer the economic benefits of membership of the group, of the social group. It would help us to look at these issues from a collective perspective. Also, because much of the debate has been diverted away into issues of language ideology, which I feel is overly utopian and aspirational, we probably need to focus on the issue of intellectual and academic leadership again. That it's quite clear that these collectivized groups in crisis need a strategic and a research agency to give intellectual backing with an empathetic ethnography rather than just a philological, disinterested or indifferent ideology that is promoted in many of the Celtic Studies departments we have at the minute. The aim of approaching it from this point of view of a new type of intellectual leadership with an assembly supported by communal trusts to manage a socio-economic market on behalf of the group, the aim of this, with the consent of the group, of course, is to promote the linguistic geography of the minority. No, there is no language in the world, probably beyond Esperanto and Yiddish, that survives without having a locus. All language, in the end, needs a locus, because that locus gives a type of sanctuary for the promotion of that group. In other words, a zone or a habitat in which the social use of that language will be promoted and protected. If we try something like this, placing the minority within their own context, we will be able to take on this issue of the crisis of the linguistic commons. We are essentially, at the minute, we are dealing with the fragility in the commons, this consumerist, laissez-faire approach to culture. And as you see, a lot of the ideology at the minute, because we are approaching it from the point of view of cultural consumption, for many people, Gaelic just represents a type of an L2, a second language, sprinkler effect within cultural nationalism of Ireland, Wales and Scotland. To a large extent, this debate is neutral on the issues of social salience or communal use. It promotes an agenda of a static right of a static agenda of linguistic rights, because it doesn't really want to take on the troubling issues of the social dynamic. And because of this combination of the sprinkler effect, a static view of language rights, essentially we end up with a optional, passive culture, a culture that is performed rather than lived. And the end result of this, especially in Ireland, where we have so much language planning and language policy provision, the policy outcome of all this is that we have tolerance for a language spoken at you. But it's not a policy that is creative or productive enough to enable a group to speak it productively and in a self-assured way. It does not foster the speaker group. It only fosters those who want to consume the language as pastime. The alternative approach I'm suggesting here is that we take on the issues of developing resilience in the linguistic commons. And of course, the issues of developing a supportive socio-economic market, it is the supportive market that will promote the issues of communal adherence, the social salience and the social vitality of Gaelic. We realise that this has to be done in a challenging demographic scenario and also very, very challenging socio-economic issues at the same time. If we try to approach it from the point of view of promoting adherence through the mechanisms of assembly and a community trust, supported by a bespoke structure, a structure set up for the condition that people live in, well then we have a much better chance of having a rooted type of leadership. A leadership that is rooted in the crisis that they live in and wants to give leadership to the group who lives with that crisis. In other words, it's direction and relevance rather than just aspiration we have at the minute. So, ha mi brín mar sin is ro'ínlach eile fad. Agus ag an íre seo ha Gàidhligh na canan Gaelach an an Eilean agus an Ollamh haid an an fír stang haid cholag sin gon fím sin a bhí a brín a-Sgrùdadh. A-Sgrùdadh na canan an san choirsnach a-Eiche. Agus ha mi a cobal amach go bhfuil 6 aireann an san a-Sgrùdadh seo. A híise an sin go mi a gamas na cosparan sòisio-chultarail an sin. Go hairid an fér sin an cóige fér an sin. Dé na projectan a chuir sin dói son misnach a háist chun choirsnach. Mar ag an íre seo, chanil mi héin a feichen go bhfuil sin a táist misnach chun choirsnach a ha is trí ris na cosparan agus na cúsin seo. So, to put an academic title on what we are trying to do, I think we need to engage in a new debate completely. We are talking now at the level of ethno-linguistic reconstructionism, that we are trying to reconstruct a group out of the crisis that they are in at the minute. And this reconstruction has a dimension relating to social dynamics. I pose the question, where is the capacity for communal leadership in the group as it exists now? From the point of view of diagnostics and prognostics, what is the collective mechanism to agree a differential diagnosis of the minority language condition? Utopianism doesn't allow for diagnosis. The issues of strategic power. What power structure will devise a targeted strategy for this group? The issue of assembly. How does the threatened group give consent for a strategy on their behalf? Nobody asks them for consent at the minute. We have support agencies and they support the agency from the perspective of the learner group rather than the native group. The issue of societal empowerment, that people feel socially empowered in the context they live in. Who will create relevant support structures? The issue of market support, socio-economic support for the group. What socio-economic structure will reward adherence? If you want adherence in a group, membership of that group in a way has to be rewarded economically. I cannot see any clear socio-economic reward for adhering to the Gaelic-speaking communities in Ireland and Scotland beyond emotional issues at the minute. We do not have practical issues to make that reward meaningful. To look at the issue of intellectual leadership then, and I return to this issue of an empathetic ethnography, that we engage in study of the Celtic language from an anthropologically empathetic way, and we marry it to realistic language planning rather than this post-structural, optional, aspirational language planning. How do we enable a structure or an agency to give intellectual leadership? And related issues there, that we engage in ongoing research and strategic advice to support this societal project of ethno-linguistic reconstructionism. So that's the issue of hoping for the best, but planning for risk also. We need at this stage, because these communities are so fragile at this stage, we need to record and retrieve the remaining ethno-linguistic resources of these groups. That we engage in planning on one level, that's hope, and we engage in retrieval at the same time. We record what remains for posterity, because if these cultures disappear, future generations will not forgive us if we do not record when they lived, how they interacted with each other, how they made their culture meaningful to each other, and how they functionalized their linguistic culture. So, just to sum up now, what I'm suggesting is that we admit to ourselves that what we're doing at the minute isn't working. If it's not working, therefore, we need to come up with a new way forward. Another thing we need to do is to refocus the strategy on reality, the reality people live with in these communities. In refocusing the strategy on reality, then it will be easier to center the strategy on the group who possess the culture rather than on the utopian aspirations for the culture in the future that has no social basis at the minute. If we refocus the strategy on the group, then we have a much better chance of building consent for the new strategy. I've been here in Solmore for 2 years at this stage, and I've seen thousands of people pass through these doors doing different courses at different academic level. The amount of goodwill for a very, very small language, when you think about it from a demographic point of view, is amazing. Scottish Gaelic here is much weaker than Irish in Ireland, but the amount of goodwill is stronger, I feel. There is a lot of cynicism now in Ireland because we are tired of the language policy cant, that there's too much talk of institutional requirements rather than talk of culture. If we can build on the amount of goodwill that is here and ask these people to support this bespoke structure, we have a much better chance of supporting Gaelic into another generation. My worry at the minute is that the provision we have now isn't linked to social reality, therefore the fragile group will disappear because it has no formal structure to support it. Mas follow me van Jaspercha. Hami giri tanga horse a-chèile. An neach Rannsachaidh a-steach Tamas Peter Vari. Na dahan boioch agus snog a bheith an PowerPoint is sé hín a chud an stúsin dói agus hami goma tanga ga. Agus hami I céad Mórag Stewart an sin an neach eadar-nàiseanta agus chanin go raibh mí cuidim léomhór Mórag an sin a brín an Gàidhlig na Halaban an san dúlchaint éideannach agam héin. So ha mí dúlaich an sin a bhórag má bheith mí a chur cuidim martain a dhéanamh eadar-nàiseach iad na Gàidhlig agam héin. Ach, betillam an Òraid seo a thuairt go críoch le leine as pí spáirteach I scríomh Ochaidh ó Hósa sa chéad páist gon teach go bhliain déag. Bé an báist a bheith ag ceann cinní bh gaoir an an siúrach Fermanach. Agus scríomh ag an am sin in bhulta Mallart Visí. Agus ha sin a cílachuch an an Gàidhlig an lá an dú. Ha cóir againn slí athrachuch má ha sin son piseach a thuairt chúisin. Agus ha mí héin a gúnta go gris. So, mór an taing son éisteach.
Mion-chànanan agus taingmhór gan Ath-sgrùdadh Conchúr Ó Giollagáin. Agus rud a thuairde na Gàidhlig a bheith suilear an dh'fhaodadh bheith sonraide héin má chuilead go suilear as a chuileadóid, mór an taingir sin. Thuair sin Òraid a bheith bríomhar agus collanta agus a bheith d'iomachí ar son t-Àrd-Ollamh agus cruinneachadh den theorsa seo. Ha ein bír bhuach Rannsachaidh a bhí dul an sás an Rannsachaidh agus a-steach agus a bhés a thuh buai. Buai súil académicach, buai buin an popfach, buai ag íre coirsnach. Agus ha fis buai na sáisiine gnáisianta agus go eadar-nàiseanta mar a chuala sin. Gon tséicamh ha nopar crachúr cutramach ag mór an íran. Agus an grún thuiachíon. Sa Òraid thug crachúr poingen agus aracaméidin a bheith suspinteach, léirsineach agus dúlánach. Agus airí tuileadh déspig agus brenachí. Taingmhór ga OGE, Eilean na Gàidhealtachd na Eilean, son uiach na haichanách. An iste, dhearach son cúisin na hort go críich, ha mi dul an ard-Ollamh ústin típ ó Solmar Ostaig, a thuair an urim agus aineachadh bó OGE bec an bblianachan ás. Son fachgal fáilte agus me gúide fachgal cóla a hort gan ard-Ollamh úr. Sé ferachan an ústin a bheith hawl agus a chunaig. Mar sin fáilte ga an ard-Ollamh ústin típ. Mór an tainga.
Ha torst tlach háiriste gá, fáilte bhlá chial a chud ar carriage agus ar cóbriche an t-Àrd-Ollamh Conchúr Ó Giollagáin, go Ard-Ollamhach Olthaigh Gàidhealtachd na Eilean. Ha sin go mór an common Conchúr, ha nám a bhain son na háirid gléasta scoinneal a thug Thighinn an drásta héin, ach ó thiúns gontéid na talant an eice a bhualachag orn an san amrí teach. Bí buai mhór eice orn tro immert táilse. sé fír deochára gatha seo a bhuaid scoileáil a bhís ag Conchúr árne an sa cholaiste. An dóid a han cánaí cho colleisteach nó collegiate. Fó húf na hollabhach, ha sin móachal go bhfuil sin an inmhe as áirte an súl na nólthaid an ruc sin. Le dleistenas nach bec na luib, a bhí a chur ar neolis agus ar tuicse go féim as le muintir na Gàidhealtachd. A bhí a torst ceannas an súl scoilearach. Agus a bhí a torst seacha tróirechag agus cáirle chialach do Gholanich, do Luch Tchekisk, agus fiús úrnan do Frúnsapalan. Si buan cúiseach úr a han an ólthaid na Gàidhealtachd agus na Eilean, ach hai clú a chosna ga héin mar a ha, le bhí ag opair an talamh conarí coirsnochgan. Buine don dúich náisianta, ach is an na bhuine sé cúteoch don dúich scíral. Ha saol mór ag opair an dá íre sin cúteoch, agus ha coliste cosna clú náisianta, agus eadar-nàiseanta don chearnaí acin, mar init náisianta son canan is cultúr na Gàidhlig. Ha sin mar cóoprichin lán cínteoch gon téit ag crochar a thuit op ransaí agus op stúri a cholanag an a léití gáid a chud is clú rís an ólthaid agus rís an tómhór. A chrochar, rhainú arab inhevolta agus ha fír jo Gàidhlig na hallapa inis iad bard ó hengi. A seo sean achcail gúibh, ach ma gúit go bhfuil acibh se cúteoch túfhail srú na muile. Ó thuúns go bhfuil sin gathuiacha go formal an Dreuchd Ard-Ollamh. Ha mi molla go bhfuil usa Conchúr Ó Giollagáin fír airí na fachcail seo. Ma siach an teachcara, siach an grách. Ma siach an teachcara, siach an grách. So betalamsa a bhí a torst gut présenta seo, agus hai caran traum.